KSL at night.
Welcome back to KSL at night. This is your host, Taylor Morgan. This segment are going to talk about the future of Utah's alternative methods municipal voting pilot program. That is a bit of a word soup. The legislature back in 2019 started a new pilot program to try out some alternative methods of voting, specifically in city or municipal elections. Since 2019, a number of Utah cities have tried ranked choice voting as a pilot program of voting in their city elections, and it has had some mixed reviews. Not all voters have had a good experience or have liked using ranked choice voting. Some have, but the Utah Legislature this coming session could consider moving on from ranked choice voting, and they could be potentially considering a different alternative method of voting in city elections called approval voting. So to help us understand a little bit more about approval voting and why it could be a good choice for Utah's municipal elections, we have with us on the program Nate Allen, Executive Director of Utah Approves. Nate, welcome to KSL at Night.
Hey, Taylor. Thanks for having me on.
Nate, as I understand it, Utah Approves is an organization led by Utahns who are working with the legislature to add potentially approval voting as a voting method for city elections in the future. Can you give us quickly, as best you can, an overview of how approval voting works, how it is potentially different than ranked choice voting, and why, what are the positives? Why might it be a better choice than ranked choice voting?
Yeah, absolutely. So simply put, approval voting allows voters to say yes or no to every candidate on the ballot, rather than saying yes to only one like our current system, or putting their candidates in an order of preference like ranked choice voting. This simple change empowers voters to express their opinion on every candidate and gives us an approval rating for each of them, which ensures the candidate with the highest approval rating wins. This change of voters giving their opinion for every candidate on the ballot actually gives candidates the ability to compete even if they have less funding, because you don't have to pick between two frontrunners in the race as a voter, and can instead choose a candidate who you feel best reflects your values. And ultimately, this means that candidates who have a broader appeal have a better chance with approval voting, because they're required to all voters when they can win and have to compete for every voter's vote.
Now, Nate, in all fairness, we will do our best to bring on someone from ranked choice voting on the program in a future episode to kind of give the other side of the story here. But my understanding in watching the latest round of city elections here in Utah just earlier this year, just a few cities, in fact, about half as many cities in 2023 used ranked choice voting than used it in 2021. There has been some concern expressed about ranked choice voting and some of the downsides. We saw here in Salt Lake City, and perhaps the most prominent municipal election to use ranked choice voting, we saw candidates expressly telling their voters in mailers and on the campaign trail not to use ranked choice voting, but to only vote for them, which seemed to defeat a little bit of the purpose there. So if approval voting, for example, let's get really specific here so our listeners understand how this works. If approval voting had been the method in Salt Lake City for that mayoral election recently that involved incumbent Mayor Aaron Mendenhall, former Mayor Rocky Anderson, and challenger Timothy Valentine, if approval voting had been the method, what would that ballot would have looked like instead?
Yeah, so one of the biggest benefits of approval voting is its simplicity. The ballot looks very similar to the ballot that most voters are used to. You still have bubbles next to every candidate's name. The only change to the ballot is to the instruction line from vote for one to vote for as many as you approve of. This is actually beneficial because it allows voters to still feel familiar with the voting system, but also adds those increased benefits of electing a candidate that's more reflective of their values. So in a race like that, we would actually still see people approve of multiple candidates, and there wouldn't be as much gamification or strategy involved.
I see. Interesting. Nate, one of the concerns that I have heard expressed by legislators, by state election officials, by county clerks throughout the state about ranked choice voting is that ranked choice voting is ultimately relies upon a third-party spreadsheet to mysteriously tabulate results, and that kind of tabulation cannot be done nor audited across county lines because all of our 29 county clerks independently administer elections. Would that same kind of process and security concern exist with approval voting?
No, and that's a great question. So aside from approval voting improving the reflection of values of the voting population, its simplicity actually allows for us to not compromise the security of our top-in-the-nation voting systems that we have in Utah. The largest reason for this is something that we call in the election world precinct summability. And all this means is that votes can still be tallied in individual voting locations with totals sent to the reporting centers rather than all ballots or individuals' ballot data needing to be transferred to that central system. So that maintains the top-notch security that we have with our current system while still improving the outcomes.
Very interesting. Nate, when we look at different methods of voting throughout, the state and in the country, Utah really does have a proud history of piloting different improvements to our election process. Utah, especially as a red state, Utah really leads the country in piloting different methods of conducting our elections to make them accessible, to make them secure. For example, Utah was the leader nationally when it came to implementing statewide vote by mail. Utah had that process in place. We piloted that, started with just a few counties, moving on statewide, going all the way back to 2013 is when we began. And by the time the COVID pandemic, hit the country in 2020, Utah was ready to go. And we didn't have any hiccups or any problems with by-mail voting because we had piloted it. So clearly, Utah Approves as an organization has an interest in piloting this new method, approval voting. What is your pitch for Utah voters, for Utah legislators on why we should try out and pilot approval voting as Utah's next iteration of improving our election process?
Yeah, well, as you said, Utah has kind of been on the forefront of common sense changes. And one of those changes is that we've been looking at what we call the plurality problem for a long time, which means that people are winning their races with far less than 50% of the vote, which doesn't give winners a high winning mandate to lead. So our message is simple. We've tried one method and it's had some mixed results so far, but we still need to solve the plurality problem. And approval voting is a simple, cheap, and effective option to pilot. There's no issue with trying to pilot it in a few cities and seeing how it goes, and we expect that voters will like it. And another thing that Utahns really care about is their tax dollars. And there's also another major cost advantage to approval voting, since the only change to the appearance of the ballot is to that instruction line, as we discussed. So this means that we don't need new voting machines or software. Mail-in voting costs won't increase. And because the ballot still looks familiar to voters, we don't need to spend as much on voter education for this simple change. So with both of these sides of us being on the forefront of these changes and needing to solve that plurality problem, with also that advantage of it being cost advantageous and not spending as much tax dollars, I think is a very common sense reform and a next step for us to take here in Utah.
Very interesting. We have now had 3 years of piloting ranked choice voting. Voters have not appeared to fall in love with that alternative method, and perhaps the time has come to give voters an experience with a different method to see how that goes. So Nate Allen, Executive Director of Utah Approves, thank you so much for joining us here on KSL at Night.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Taylor.
Listeners, stay tuned right here. Coming up next, we are going to have an important discussion about volunteerism in our state and nation and how it is on the decline and what we can do about it. Stay right here.